Going into the 2023 NFL Draft, there were two quarterback prospects who could have been taken at number 1 overall. The guy that everyone expected to go number 1 was a dude by the name of Bryce Young. He was a 5-star recruit, had won the Heisman at Alabama, and looked like a surefire bet to be a franchise quarterback in the NFL. At number 2, you had CJ Stroud, who is also a 5-star, had a terrific career at Ohio State, but some had some question marks around him and thought that maybe he could not translate to the NFL as well as Bryce did. Well, personally speaking, till I was blue in the face, I was saying that the Panthers needed to draft Stroud. I always thought he was going to be the better quarterback. He had the look, he had the it factor, and I didn't care about any of the question marks. Now as we flash forward just a year and a half later, CJ Stroud is one of the best young players in the NFL, and Bryce Young might be the worst young player in the NFL. Bryce Young has been benched for Andy Dalton. He's been absolutely terrible for the Panthers, and it looks like he could be one of the biggest number 1 overall pick busts we have ever seen. It's really unfortunate because I don't think Bryce Young's a bad guy by any means, but I just don't think he should have been the number 1 overall pick. I've been saying that for months, as I never thought he was that great in terms of the NFL, but again, what the heck do I know? Sadly though, Bryce Young is probably the most clowned on young player in the NFL right now, and in today's video, I'm going to go through an entire rise and fall of Bryce Young. We're going to talk about how he became a 5-star recruit to begin with, his terrific career at Alabama, and what the heck has gone wrong for him while he's on the Panthers. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about what happened to Bryce Young. While many thought that Bryce Young was definitely going to hit, CJ Stroud was a safe bet. CJ Stroud in my eyes was the safer bet, and that's where I bring in the sponsor of today's video, MyBookie. It is that time of the year as winning season is back, football is back, and MyBookie is here to make sure you are ready to cash in on all the action. This season, MyBookie is pulling out all the stops with incredible promotions like a weekly risk-free boost on Thursdays where you can bet without a sweat. If your bet hits, you win big. If it doesn't, forget it. MyBookie will refund your wager. But that's just the beginning. MyBookie is giving away hundreds of thousands in prizes with their Super, Survivor, and Square contests. Get your entries now in for your shot at huge cash rewards. When you're ready to get started, be sure to use my promo code FISHER50 and make sure to get some extra cash on top of your first deposit. Okay, but what do you get when you use my promo code? Well, if you type in Fisher50, you'll get up to $1,000 in a welcome bonus bet, plus a $10 casino chip. MyBookie's tiered bonuses make it easy to deposit with crypto or with credit, and the bigger your deposit, the bigger your bonus. The bonus would be 100% match up to $1,000 plus a $10 casino chip. As of now, loyalty plays off with MyBookie Plus. The more you play, the more you win. It's simple. Climb through the tiers of loyalty rewards programs to unlock even more epic promotions, exclusive giveaways, and bigger rewards. With MyBookie, you can bet on anything, anywhere, at any time, and make your season a winning season. Be sure to check out my link down below and use my promo code FISHER50. That is FISHER50. In order to understand how Bryce Young got to this point, we first need to go back in time. He was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 2001 to a very sports-oriented family. His father, Craig Young, was a mental health specialist whose career really took off as the byproduct of his own football career at UCLA failing. But he was always in his son's corner when it came to developing on the football field, according to Malik James, who coached Bryce in 7-on-7 football. He said, quote, "He's not a typical quarterback dad. He's mild-mannered, he pays attention but stays behind the scenes. He and his wife kind of just let their son do his thing, and they don't step on any toes." From a young age, Bryce had the opportunity to work with many quarterback coaches in order to develop past what the coaches would project his ceiling to be because of his height. While it may seem laughable at this point to say Bryce Young was originally an underdog, when he was in middle school, he definitely was. Early on, his family moved from Philly to Pasadena, California. He was a great talent and in a lot of sports, including basketball, where he had legitimate D1 interest and was a star for his club team, but Bryce always wanted to focus on playing football and playing quarterback. At Pasadena, he originally attended Cathedral High School, which was a high school in Los Angeles, and went on the team and ended up going 11-1 in 2016 and 5-0 in their high school league play. Before he even passed for a down in Pasadena, though, he was getting interest from one particular coach and one particular program at the Division I level. That was Cliff Kingsbury at Texas Tech, who thought he could succeed in the air raid. Coach Kingsbury said, quote, "I have to see him live. If you can get him here and he looks anything like he does right now, I'll pull the trigger." So after a quick meeting with Coach Kingsbury in Lubbock, Bryce got his first scholarship offer when he was in 8th grade. but he felt he could do better and got ready for the season. Despite being a little short for the position, he actually started as a true freshman and threw for 1,400 yards, 14 touchdowns, and 6 picks, and he also added over 150 rushing yards and 4 touchdowns on the ground. It wasn't long until he wasn't a secret anymore, and his offer list grew a lot between the end of his freshman year and the beginning of his sophomore year. He added offers from Nebraska, Hawaii, Louisville, Utah, and Colorado before the summer even started. Then that offseason, he got offers from Oklahoma, USC, Georgia, and Oregon. He was a hot commodity, and a lot of it had to do with how good of a passer he was and how good at managing the game of football he was. The next year in 2017 as a sophomore, he put up 3,400 yards with 41 touchdowns and 3 picks. The Phantoms went 10-2 that season, and it looked like Bryce was now going to compete with DJ Uiagalelei as the best quarterback in the state of California for the class of 2020. After the season, he earned an offer from Alabama and decided he would transfer to Mater Dei High School to take over for their last starting quarterback, JT Daniels. Before the season started, though, he'd announced his commitment to USC. Bryce elevated himself at the highest level of competition, throwing for 3,846 yards, 39 touchdowns, and 6 picks, as well as adding 286 yards and 4 rushing touchdowns on the ground. Mater Dei went 14-1 with a win over DJ Uiagalelei and St. John Bosco, while Bryce was at the helm. But while he was getting all these accolades in 2019, Bryce didn't close off his recruitment either after committing to USC. While MD went 12-1, Bryce had thrown for 4,528 yards with an unbelievable 58 touchdowns and just 6 picks, while also rushing for 357 yards and 10 touchdowns as well. He was California's Gatorade Player of the Year, the USA Today High School Offensive Player of the Year, and because he didn't lock in his commitment to USC, he ended up decommitting halfway through the year and flipped to Alabama to play for head coach Nick Saban and sit behind Mac Jones. He finished his high school career as the #1 overall recruit in the class of 2020, being the best quarterback in the country, ahead of guys like DJU, CJ Stroud, and Carson Beck. So, how did he end up doing at Bama? So obviously, he arrived at Alabama in 2020 and immediately slotted in as the backup behind Mac Jones, who did a pretty good job filling in for Tua. The 2020 Tide were absolutely stacked everywhere on offense and defense, and they rolled everyone on their schedule, even in a weird and tough pandemic season, and caught a lot of teams off guard. Their closest game was to Florida in the SEC Championship game by 8 to end the season, and part of their dominance meant that Bryce was not the starter that year. He found his first game action in Week 1 against Missouri, going 5 of 8 for 54 yards. He wouldn't play again for the next few weeks until Week 5 against Tennessee, where he threw for 30 yards, and then the next week against Mississippi State, he went 0 of 2. He wouldn't throw his first touchdown pass until they played Kentucky, where he once again entered the game as a backup and went 2 of 2 for 53 yards and a touchdown. He played in 8 games that season, throwing for 156 yards, a touchdown, and 59% of his passes being completed. Mac Jones led the FBS in passing completion and yardage and helped bring Bama to an SEC and national championship. In the offseason, Alabama lost Mac Jones to the NFL since he was taken in the first round by the New England Patriots. This meant that Bryce would be the starter as a true sophomore, and he'd have one of the best offenses in college football around him. Jamison Williams and John Mechie were 2 of the best receivers in college football that year, and he also had Brian Robinson and Trey Sanders at running back. He made his first start against number 14 Miami and De'Aaron King, throwing for 344 yards and 4 touchdowns, and Bama would win 44-13. After beating up on an FCS Mercer school in Week 2, they'd beat number 11 Florida in a close game in Gainesville, 31-29. In that game, he had 240 yards and 3 touchdowns, and it looked like Bama was not missing out on anything. He'd end up throwing for 313 yards and 5 touchdowns in a victory over Southern Miss, and then would put up 241 yards and 2 touchdowns in a huge victory over a good Ole Miss team by 1 point. Then came the Texas A&M game. The Alabama offense just couldn't get much going in the first half, being down 24-10. Despite a comeback attempt and Bryce Young throwing for nearly 400 yards and 3 touchdowns, the Aggies scored 10 unanswered, and Texas A&M ended up winning the game 38-41. Bryce would bounce back though, as he had 4 touchdowns in a win over Mississippi State, 2 touchdowns in a win over Tennessee, and then they had a huge showdown on the road against LSU. In that game, Bryce threw for 302 yards and 2 touchdowns, and they would beat the Tigers 20-14. After then blowing past New Mexico State, he did something special against number 21 Arkansas. In that game, he broke the Alabama passing yards in a game record with 559 yards in a 42-35 shootout victory over the Razorbacks. He also had 5 touchdowns in that game. He then had one of the worst games of the season in the Iron Bowl, as they barely beat a 6-5 Auburn team, but he would throw 300 yards and 2 touchdowns, and his late 2-point conversion to John Mechie won it for the Tide. After that, he led Bama past number 1 Georgia in the SEC championship game, throwing for 421 yards and 3 touchdowns, and became the first Alabama quarterback in history to win the Heisman Trophy. He led the SEC in passing yards and touchdowns with 4,872 and 47 scores. He's also a consensus All-American, won AP Player of the Year, the Davey O'Brien Award, the Manning Award, the Maxwell Award, and the SEC Offensive Player of the Year Award. After the SEC championship game, Bama was ranked number 1 in the country and beat a really talented Cincinnati team 27-6, but then lost to Georgia in the national championship game 33-18. Bryce Young threw for 369 yards and had a costly pick 6 to Keely Ringo. So going into the season in 2022, hopes were high for Bryce and Bama as a whole since they still had a lot of talent on the roster. But both Williams and Mechie were drafted, and Brian Robinson also went to the draft. His top 2 receivers of the year would be Jermaine Burton and Trayshawn Holden, as well as Ja'Cory Brooks and Jahmyr Gibbs. After starting out with a 55-0 win over Utah State, they started out strong with a 55-0 win over Utah State, and in that game, Bryce had 200 yards and 5 touchdowns. Alabama then traveled to Austin to take on Texas, and in that game, the Tide scored 10 points in the fourth quarter to win 20-19. He followed it up the next week with a big performance against UL Monroe, and then had 385 yards and 4 touchdowns in a dominant victory over Vanderbilt. Against Arkansas the next week, he did struggle early on and eventually got hurt with a shoulder injury in the second quarter. Jalen Milroe had to come in to replace him, and luckily they were able to win that game. He sat out the following week against Texas A&M and then came back for the game against number 6 Tennessee. In that game that I was personally at, he threw for 455 yards and 2 touchdowns, but couldn't outduel Hendon Hooker in Tennessee, and the Vols beat Alabama in one of the craziest upsets of all time, 52-49. Alabama would struggle a little bit down the stretch, beating Mississippi State, but then losing to Jaden Daniels and LSU, and then quietly sneaking past Ole Miss. They would blow out Austin Peay, and then would beat Auburn to finish at number 5 in the country and 2nd in the West. They'd miss out on the championship game and would have to settle for the Sugar Bowl against K-State. In that game, they would dominate 45-20. Bryce finished the year with 3,328 passing yards, 32 touchdowns, and 5 picks, enough for 6th in the Heisman voting, and now he would have to duel it out with C.J. Stroud for the number 1 overall pick in the 2023 NFL Draft. After the Sugar Bowl, he decided that he would declare, and in total at Bama, he threw for 8,356 yards, 80 touchdowns, and 12 picks in just 34 games. He went 23-4, averaged over 245 yards per game, and also had 2.35 touchdowns per game. He became one of the most prolific quarterbacks in college football history, and now people are wondering how he would do in the NFL. So, how did that all go for him? A lot of teams were tripping over each other trying to trade up for the number 1 overall pick, and in 2023, Carolina finally won out. They traded the 9th overall pick, DJ Moore, and a few other picks to the Bears in order to have the rights to take Bryce Young first overall. There were a few things about Bryce that the NFL didn't like, though. He stood at just 5'10" at the combine, making him one of the shortest quarterbacks to start in the NFL alongside Kyler Murray. But Kyler had some success when all the pieces were together, and Bryce looked really good at Bama, so the Panthers felt as if they had found themselves their franchise quarterback. The problem was the Panthers had been notoriously awful for the last few years, going 5-12 in 2021 with Darnold, going 5-12 in 2021. They went 7-10 in 2022, and the only offensive weapon that the Panthers really had was DJ Moore, and they traded him away to get Bryce. That meant that Bryce was not only on a team with a new head coach after they fired Matt Rule, but he was going to be plopped onto the middle of a team that had one of the worst offenses in the NFL on paper and wouldn't be able to give him any help in their growing. Their quarterback's coach, Josh McCown, was fired a third of the way into the season, and their offensive coordinator, Thomas Brown, had never been a coordinator before. Carolina would ultimately go 2-15 in 2023 with Bryce at the helm, but looking behind the surface, it was pretty clear that it wasn't his fault. Panthers owner David Tepper fired Frank Reich after going 1-10, knowing that Reich inherited a really bad roster and needed a few seasons to help build the team. He also knew that Bryce probably needed to sit on the bench and learn for a season or two until the team was ready to play competitive football. Instead, Bryce was thrown into the Wolves. In Week 1 against the Falcons, Bryce threw his first career touchdown pass, but also threw 2 picks. Both were on throws over the middle where Bryce just didn't see he was there. There was instantly some talk that Bryce might be a bust because of his height keeping him from seeing the field, and he looked a lot better in Week 2, throwing for 153 yards and a touchdown in the loss to the Saints. But he hurt his ankle in Week 3 and didn't play again until next week against the Vikings. The Panthers didn't win a single game until they played the Texans in Week 8, beating number 2 overall pick C.J. Stroud 15-13 and throwing for 235 yards and a touchdown. But as the season went on, Stroud got better and Bryce got worse. They'd lose their next 6 games until Bryce was able to lead a fourth quarter comeback against the Falcons to win 9-7. The next week against the Packers, Bryce had the best game of his NFL career to that point, throwing for 312 yards and 2 touchdowns, but they still ended up losing. They didn't win another game the rest of the year, as he finished the season with 2,800 yards, 11 touchdowns, and 10 picks, performing worse in those games than his backup Andy Dalton did. Instantly, it looked like the Panthers had ruined him because it didn't make sense for him to be playing as poorly as he did when he was so good at Alabama. He's also sacked an insane 62 times last season, and the Panthers panicked at the prospect of ruining a good quarterback, so they went out and hired another head coach, Dave Canales, who was the OC for the Bucs. They tried to get some weapons for Bryce in this draft, taking South Carolina receiver Xavier Legette, and then Texas running back Jonathan Brooks and tight end Jatavian Sanders, as well as Deontay Johnson from the Steelers. But so far, it looks like it is not working. The Panthers are 0-2 to start the year, and not only are the weapons not helping Bryce, but he looks downright terrible. The Panthers had the worst offense and the worst defense in the league, and that showed in Week 1's 47-10 blowout against the Saints. In that game, Bryce only threw for 161 yards and was sacked 4 times and had 2 really bad interceptions. His only touchdown on the day was a rushing touchdown. The next week against the Chargers, he was only sacked twice, but still only threw for 84 yards with no touchdowns and a pick. Through 2 games this year, Bryce has thrown for just 245 yards and no touchdowns, and he has 3 interceptions and a QB rating of 9.4. He's one of the worst quarterbacks in the league, and the Panthers decided to make a change this week and will start Andy Dalton instead of Bryce for the foreseeable future. It's hard to tell right now who's at fault, but Bryce is definitely getting worse week by week. He did look really good in offenses at Bama run by Bill O'Brien. It could be that a shorter quarterback needs to be more dynamic and play more unique offenses at the next level. Since Bryce is 5'10" and he isn't a scrambling quarterback, his height is definitely putting him at a disadvantage. But I think the real reason he's so terrible is that Carolina ruined him by not giving him any support in the coaching ranks. He hasn't had a real quarterbacks coach since college, since his current QB coach was the quality control coach for the Cowboys, and his new OC this year was the receivers coach for the Buccaneers last year and never called plays in his career. Add that to the roster situation in Carolina, and it's pretty clear to me that he's gotten no support so far, and literally might need to take the Baker Mayfield route and going to a new team and being a backup for a little before he can learn and build his confidence back. Overall, while a lot of the blame can be placed on the Panthers, Bryce himself just has not looked that good, and I honestly never really thought he would, to be honest. His height was always a disadvantage, and I never really thought he had that sort of it factor that Stroud had. Maybe Bryce Young will come back and dominate the league, but at this point it looks highly unlikely. But what do you guys think? If you're a Bama or an NFL or Panthers fan, what has gone wrong for Bryce Young? Who's to blame for this situation? And what topic should I do next? Be sure to let me know down below. Leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.